The sound was almost imperceptible, a faint scratching from deep inside the freezer. Ruth froze mid-step, her breath catching in her throat. For a split second, she thought it was the wind brushing against the windows again, but no. This was sharper, desperate, something clawing its way through silence. The hum of the freezer filled the kitchen, low and steady, masking everything else. She stared at it, her heart thudding harder than it had in years. Nothing alive should be in there. Nothing. She moved closer, her slippers whispering against the worn linoleum. A handle gleamed dully under the dim kitchen light, an ordinary thing, and yet it felt menacing now. That noise, it came again, louder, frantic, a muted cry that stabbed through the quiet like a plea. For a moment, Ruth just stood there, one hand hovering over the handle, a lifetime of caution in her trembling fingers. What if it wasn't real? What if she'd finally gone mad in this big empty house? But then came the sound again, and this time it was unmistakable. Claws against metal, a sound no hallucination could make. She gripped the handle. The seal resisted, rubber stiff with age, and the door groaned open like an old hinge in a haunted room. A blast of icy air rushed out, chilling her to the bone. Her eyes squinted against the frost and shadow, and then they widened in horror. Nestled between frozen peas and a ham from last Christmas were two enormous eyes, wide and glassy with terror, staring straight into hers. A living, breathing cat. For a heartbeat, Ruth couldn't process it. The creature's fur was stiff, clumped with frost, whiskers tipped in white. Its tiny chest rose and fell so faintly it might as well have been smoke. Its body sagged when she reached in, as limp as thawing cloth, yet those eyes burned with life, a fragile, flickering life. Her own breath hitched as panic surged through her veins. She plunged both hands into the icy cavern and scooped the animal against her chest. It felt impossibly light, fragile, its bones sharp under her fingertips like brittle twigs. "Oh God, oh God." The words slipped from her lips, a desperate mantra. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping on the rug, clutching the frozen creature like a child. It didn't move, didn't fight. Only a weak twitch of an ear told her it was still here, clinging by threads. And then the guilt hit sharp, suffocating. She had closed that freezer door, hours ago, maybe longer. How had this happened? Did it sneak in when she was rearranging the shelves earlier, distracted by the news on the radio? The thought made her stomach twist like a knife. If this little soul died, it would be on her. Her mind raced as she dropped to her knees near the old fireplace. She pulled the faded quilt from the armchair, wrapping the cat like she had once wrapped her baby boy decades ago. The memory of that warmth cut deep against the chill now radiating from the creature in her arms. She pressed it close, but the cold seeped through her sweater, numbing her skin. It was like hugging a block of ice that breathed. She couldn't lose it, not this time. Ruth scrambled for the heating pad she kept for her aching joints. Her hands shook so hard she nearly yanked the cord from the wall. She wrapped the pad around the cat's frail body, layering it under the quilt. "Don't you quit on me," she whispered, her voice trembling. She hadn't prayed in years, not since the hospital nights with her husband, when no amount of pleading could change the ending. But now every beat of her heart was a prayer. "Please stay alive." The radio muttered on in the background, oblivious to the storm inside Ruth's chest. Words like record low temperatures and winter warnings spilled into the room, making the irony almost cruel. Outside, the wind clawed at the windows, rattling the glass as if to remind her how merciless cold could be. Inside, Ruth cradled a life teetering on the edge, her breath fogging in the chilly air of her kitchen. She felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Minutes crawled by like hours. She kept the little body pressed close, rocking gently, whispering words she hadn't spoken in years. Soft things. Promises. Memories. She told it about the garden she used to tend, about the stray dogs she fed on the porch last summer, about the man who once filled this house with laughter. She didn't even know why she was talking. Maybe for herself. Maybe because silence was too heavy, a weight to bear in this moment. Then it happened. The tiniest sound so faint she almost doubted it at first. A mule. Broken. Breathless, but real. It cracked the air like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Ruth felt tears burn her eyes as a choked laugh escaped her lips. "There you are," she whispered, pressing her cheek against the quilt. "You hold on, you hear me? You hold on." She didn't know if the cat would make it through the night. She didn't know where it came from or why fate had chosen her kitchen for this cruel twist. But as she stared down at those eyes still glassy, still fighting, she felt something stir in her chest. Something that had been frozen for far too long, hope, fragile and flickering, like the life she held in her arms. Because this wasn't just an animal rescue story. It wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a lifeline for them both, and Ruth knew she'd do anything to keep that spark alive. Ruth stayed kneeling on the living room floor, her knees pressed into the old rug, every joint screaming in protest. But she didn't move. She couldn't. The quilt-wrapped bundle in her arms was everything now, a fragile heartbeat that tethered her to this moment, to life itself. The little cat had mewed once, but since then, silence again. Ruth pressed her ear close to its side, holding her breath. There it was, faint, irregular, but still there. The sound of a fight. She refused to let it lose. The heating pad gave off gentle warmth, but it wasn't enough. Ruth could feel the chill clinging stubbornly to the animal's fur, sinking into its bones. She needed more. Something stronger. Her eyes darted around the room, desperate. Then she remembered the space heater in the bedroom. It was dusty, temperamental, but it worked. She laid the cat on the couch, layering the quilt thicker around it like a cocoon. "Stay with me," she murmured, as if the creature could understand. Then she hurried down the hall, her slippers sliding, heart pounding so loud it drowned out the howl of the wind outside. The heater rattled when she plugged it in, coughing out a blast of warm air that smelled faintly of metal and dust. She dragged it into the living room, setting it near the couch but not too close. The cat's eyes flickered at the change in temperature, and that tiny reaction sent a wave of hope flooding through Ruth. She adjusted the quilt again, tucking the edges snug around its body. The ears were still icy cold, but its chest rose with more rhythm now, even if weak. She placed her hand gently over its ribcage, feeling each fragile rise and fall like counting seconds on a clock. "What's your name?" she whispered, studying its face under the glow of the heater. Frost still clung to the tips of its whiskers, and its nose looked raw from the cold. Its fur was patchy, not the sleek coat of a pampered house cat. This was a stray, thin, weathered, probably fighting for scraps, long before fate threw it into that freezer. Ruth wondered how it had even gotten inside. She thought of the back door, the way it sometimes didn't latch properly when the wind slammed it. Had it snuck in this morning, drawn by the smell of food? She remembered pulling meat from the freezer earlier, humming an old tune, the radio playing in the background. Had it slipped past her then? The thought made her stomach tighten with guilt. She had almost killed this little soul without even knowing. Ruth sat back, wiping her damp palms on her skirt. Her mind felt like a whirlwind, half racing through what-ifs, half clinging to practical tasks. She fetched a bowl of warm water and a soft cloth, dabbing gently at the cat's fur to melt away the frost. Its skin twitched weakly under her touch, a sign of life that made her exhale a shaky breath. "That's it. You're safe now," she whispered, her voice breaking. She didn't cry often these days, hadn't, really, since the funeral, but now the tears came hot and unbidden, rolling down her cheeks as she worked. The smell of thawing fur and old fabric filled the room, mixing with the faint metallic tang of the heater. The house had never felt so alive. For years, silence had been her only company, silence and the ghost of laughter that once filled these walls. Now there was breathing again, faint but real, and it made something deep inside her ache with longing. She thought of her husband, of the dog they'd had when they were young, of Sunday mornings when life still felt like a promise instead of an echo. And for the first time in years, she spoke out loud, not to a memory, not to an empty room, but to this small, stubborn fighter. "You're not going anywhere," she said softly, brushing a hand along its bony back. "Not today. Not if I can help it." Minutes blurred into an hour. Ruth never left its side. She adjusted the heater, rotated the heating pad, whispered nonsense words like spells to keep the world from taking this little life away. So slowly, she almost didn't notice the cat's breathing steadied. Its paws twitched under the quilt, and a low, broken sound rumbled in its throat. A purr, weak, halting, but enough to make Ruth laugh through her tears. The sound was like music in this quiet house. She reached for her phone on the coffee table, hesitating. She hadn't called anyone in days, weeks. Who would she call now? Her son, miles away, busy with his life? The vet? Her fingers hovered, then pulled back. No. She wasn't ready to let the world in, not yet. This was their fight, hers and the cat's. A secret battle waged against the cold, against loneliness, against everything that had frozen her heart these past few years. Outside, night pressed against the windows and snowflakes spiraled like tiny ghosts in the darkness. Ruth added a log to the fire, its crackle blending with the hum of the heater. She sat back down, stroking the cat's head with careful fingers. Its eyes opened a fraction, glazed but alive, and met hers. In that look was something raw and wordless, something that said thank you, or maybe just don't stop. And Ruth felt the weight of the world shift, just a little, as if this fragile creature had tilted her axis back toward the light. She leaned down, her lips close to its ear. "You're going to make it," she whispered. "I promise." And as the heater hummed and the snow piled high outside, Ruth made herself a silent vow. Whatever it took, warmth, food, sleepless nights, she would keep that promise. But as she stood to fetch more firewood, a sound froze her in place. Not from the cat this time, but from the kitchen. A sharp clatter, like something falling to the floor. Ruth's heart slammed against her ribs as her eyes darted toward the shadowed doorway. The freezer door. Had she closed it? The sound came again, sharp clatter, metallic and jarring in the stillness. Ruth froze halfway to the door, her breath caught like a bird in a cage. The glow of the fireplace didn't reach this far. The kitchen doorway yawned like the mouth of a cave. She waited, ears straining, every muscle tight with the weight of not knowing. Nothing, just the wind scratching against the windows. A lonely, hollow sound that felt too close. But she knew what she'd heard. A clatter, a fall. Something moving in the kitchen where there should be nothing but cold and stillness. Her eyes darted to the quilted bundle on the couch. Frost was sleeping, or something like it, his chest lifting and fragile. Uncertain rhythm, his tiny body barely more than a whisper against the worn fabric. "Stay with me," she murmured, voice trembling, though the cat could not hear, or maybe like her, it understood how thin the line between life and loss really was. She crept toward the kitchen, each step slower than the last, slippers sighing across the hardwood. The hum of the freezer grew louder, almost mocking. There it stood against the far wall, its white surface glinting under the weak ceiling light. Closed. Perfect. Ordinary. And yet, her pulse galloped as if the thing were a predator waiting to strike. The linoleum glittered faintly with frost, a cruel little breadcrumb trail from the door to where she stood. Ruth's breath fogged the air as she gripped the handle, her palm clammy against cold metal. She yanked the door wide. Light spilled out harsh and sterile. Rows of vegetables, a frost-caked ham, boxes stacked in rigid formation. Nothing alive, nothing waiting to die. Relief hit her like a wave she could barely stand under. She laughed, short and shaky, one hand clutching her chest. "You're losing it, Ruth," she whispered, the words shaking like autumn leaves in wind. She shut the door, the seal sucking closed with a hiss, and froze again, because another sound came then. Not from the freezer, but from the back door. A whisper of movement, the faint creak of hinges surrendering. Her eyes snapped toward the shadowed entryway. And there it was. The door, ajar just enough for a spill of frigid air to curl in, carrying with it the bitter tang of snow. A shudder rolled through her bones as she stepped closer, slippers soaking the thin drift already creeping across the floor. The gap in the frame was no accident. The lock, old, stubborn on good days, had given way under the assault of wind and neglect. Beyond the threshold, the world was a white void, flakes swirling like restless ghosts. And stamped into that soft new snow were tracks, tiny at first glance but too many. Leading away into the dark, her stomach turned to stone. The cat hadn't wandered in by chance. It had come running from something. Something that might still be out there. Something hungry enough to drive it straight into a freezer for warmth. She slammed the door shut, twisting the lock until it screamed in protest, then shoved the old wooden chair under the knob for good measure. For a long moment she stood there, breath heaving, pulse roaring like a storm tide in her ears. Then she turned, slow as thaw, and walked back to the living room. Frost lay where she left him, tiny chest fluttering like paper in a breeze. His eyes opened at her approach, two pale embers flickering in the gloom. She sank into the armchair, the weight of the world pressing down, and let out a shaky laugh that tasted of fear. "You brought company, didn't you?" Her voice cracked. "What were you running from, little fighter?" The fire popped in the grate, showering sparks like stars against the dark. Ruth reached for the cat, her fingers trembling as they brushed along the damp ridges of his spine. He twitched faintly, then miracle of miracles leaned into her touch, a sigh threading from his throat. And then came that sound, a purr, faint as breath, but real. Ruth's heart stuttered under its fragile weight. She bent low, pressing her forehead to the quilt. "That's it. You're safe now," she whispered, though the words felt like a vow. The night thickened, storm screaming like some wild thing in the eaves, but Ruth stayed where she was, one hand on the pulse of life under threadbare fabric. Hours stretched like frozen rivers. She didn't dare sleep, not while death still lingered so close. Not while those faint purrs ebbed and flowed like a tide threatening to retreat forever. She shifted the heating pad every hour, fed the fire until her back screamed, whispered nonsense words into fur that smelled faintly of frost and smoke. And through it all, memories surfaced like ghosts. Her husband's laugh rolling through this room, her boy's muddy boots by the door, the feel of another small body years ago now cradled against her chest. She thought she'd buried that tenderness, locked it away like winter locking the earth. But here it was, alive and clawing its way back, as relentless as the wind outside. And yet beyond the warmth of firelight, darkness pressed like something alive. Each groan of the old timbers, each whisper of snow against glass felt like breath on her neck. Her gaze kept sliding to the window, to the storm swallowing the yard. Were those tracks still out there? Was something moving just beyond sight? Circling? Waiting? She forced her eyes back to Frost, tracing the faint rise and fall of his ribs. "You hold on," she murmured. "You hear me? We're both getting through this night." But deep down, a colder question lingered like a thorn. What if the thing that drove him here wasn't just hunger? What if it was still hunting, and now it knew where to find warmth? Her grip on the quilt tightened. The storm roared, rattling the door like a warning she didn't want to understand. And in that brittle, endless hour before dawn, Ruth realized something with bone-deep certainty. She wasn't just saving Frost. She was bracing for a fight, against the dark outside, against the hollow inside her that had swallowed too much already. Morning broke in muted gray, washing the world in a pale, brittle light. The storm had spent itself during the night, leaving behind a silence so deep it rang in Ruth's ears like a held breath. She stirred in the armchair, stiff from hours spent upright, her shawl clinging like a second skin. For one disorienting moment, she thought she'd dreamed it all, the scratching, the freezer, the frantic hours spent cradling life against the dark. Then she felt the weight on her lap, slight, warm, impossibly real. Frost. The name formed soundlessly on her lips as she glanced down. The cat was curled into a tight comma on the quilt, his fur still patchy, still rough, but no longer stiff with cold. His sides rose and fell in steady rhythm, and the faint vibration of a purr hummed through the fabric into her bones. Ruth let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her chest hollowing with relief. Against all odds, against the night, the storm, the silence that had nearly swallowed them both, he had made it. She smoothed the hand over his back, marveling at the fragile strength threaded through his tiny frame. "You stubborn little miracle," she whispered, voice raw with exhaustion and awe. Her throat tightened unexpectedly, and before she could stop them, tears spilled hot and unchecked, carving rivers through the frost on her skin. She laughed softly, a sound tangled with sobs. "Guess I'm crying over a cat now," she muttered, shaking her head, but there was no shame in it. Just release. Just life coming back in unexpected ways. The fire had dwindled to embers. She rose slowly, limbs heavy with fatigue, and coaxed the flames back to life. The smell of wood smoke curled through the room like an old memory, one that didn't ache quite so sharply now. When the fire crackled strong again, she padded to the kitchen, careful not to disturb her guest, and warmed a saucer of milk until it steamed faintly. On the counter, the freezer loomed like a white sentinel, its hum steady and indifferent. She paused, hand on the saucer, staring at it. For a fleeting second, she saw it again. Those wide, frost-rimmed eyes blinking out of the dark, a living plea against the cold. It could have ended differently. So easily, the thought made her chest clench. She closed her eyes and whispered a silent vow, never again. No creature would suffer like that under her roof, not if she could help it. When she returned, Frost was awake, head lifting weakly, ears pricking at the sound of her steps. "Look who's up," she murmured, setting the saucer near his nose. The cat sniffed, then leaned forward and began to lap with delicate urgency, his tongue rasping against porcelain like a tiny saw. Ruth knelt beside him, one hand resting lightly on the quilt, and watched as hope became something tangible, warm milk disappearing one ripple at a time, life flowing back into what had once been ice. "You're not going back out there," she said softly, almost to herself. The words settled in the air like a promise, irrevocable and real. The day wore on in small, tender increments. Ruth mended an old wool blanket while Frost dozed by the fire, his paws twitching in dreams. She filled bowls, changed water, even found an old basket she lined with a cushion from her late husband's chair. Each task felt like a stitch pulling her closer to something she hadn't dared hope for. Purpose. The silence that had once gnawed at her was still there, but now it hummed differently, not empty, but full, threaded with the sound of breathing. The rustle of fur, the faint thrum of a purr weaving through the quiet like a heartbeat. By late afternoon, the storm's aftermath lay spread beyond the window's snow, heaped in drifts, the sky a hard, polished silver. Ruth stood by the back door, mug in hand, staring at the whiteness. It looked almost peaceful now, all that fury smoothed into stillness. But the memory of those tracks lingered, etched in her mind like scars. She wondered what had left them: fox, coyote, hunger itself. Whatever it was, it had driven a fragile life into her freezer, straight into her arms, and somehow that twist of fate felt like more than chance. Her gaze dropped to the lock, now bolted tight with the old chair braced against it. She smiled faintly and turned away. Let the wild keep its secrets. She had her own now, a small one, curled on a cushion by the fire. A secret stitched together from frost and warmth, silence and heartbeat. As evening bled into night, Ruth sank into her chair, fatigue washing over her like tide water. Frost lifted his head, blinking drowsily, then slow, deliberate climbed onto her lap. His paws pressed into her thigh with feather-light weight, and then he curled, tucking his nose under his tail, his purr deepening into something steady, content. The sound filled her like light. She rested her hand on his back, feeling the life pulsing there, warm and stubborn, and let her eyes close. For the first time in years, sleep came easy not as an escape, but as a gift. When she woke hours later, the fire was low, the room dim. Frost was still there, a warm weight anchoring her to the present. And in that quiet, Ruth realized something with bone-deep clarity. She wasn't alone anymore. Not in this house. Not in this life. She glanced toward the freezer, its white bulk fading into shadow, and felt a strange, fierce gratitude for the things she'd once cursed. Because the real story wasn't about what had happened inside its frozen walls. It was about what thawed in her own heart. She bent, pressing her lips to the crown of Frost's head, whispering words that felt like a prayer and a promise all at once. "Welcome home."